Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm an Airbus pilot, and welcome to your winter operations refresher for the winter season 2025 to 2026. Now, as always, this is just a video meant for flight simulations, so if you're a real pilot, do refer to your official manuals. Also, do note that I am tailoring this one to what we can and cannot do in Microsoft Flight Simulator, so this may not be a complete dive into everything that would be required in the real world. Do note, however, that I have done some little bit more extensive winter ops tutorials in the past year and the year before, which I'm going to link in the video description below. So if you're interested in an hour plus of winter operations guidance, then check out those more complete tutorials. This year I just want to focus on the most important point, because, well, I know that barely anyone pays more than 10 minutes of attention to a YouTube video. Alright then, so let's start with some general definitions here before going into the most important specifics. So in general we got two types of winter conditions. The first one is icing conditions and the second is freezing conditions. Icing conditions are defined as a temperature of plus 10 degrees Celsius or less and visible moisture. Visible moisture can be anything from rain over fog over low clouds, etc. Now, freezing conditions are defined as a temperature of plus 3 degrees Celsius or less and visible moisture, which again can be anything from snow, rain, fog, low clouds, you name it. Note that visible moisture can also just refer to wet surfaces on the airport, even though the rain may already have stopped and you may have clear skies again. So just apply some good judgment there to determine in which conditions you are. Generally, when in icing conditions, the use of engine anti-ice is mandatory and the pilot in command, that's you, should evaluate the necessity of further procedures. When in freezing conditions, the full cold weather procedures should be applied. Now, when talking about icing, we are always talking about how to remove icing. And there is two different terms over here which you should be able to distinguish between. So there is anti-icing, which means preventing the buildup of ice on the airplane, and then there is de-icing, which refers to removing already accumulated ice from the airplane. Now, a perfect example of this is the anti-icing systems you got in your airplane, because you got engine anti-ice, which literally works by heating up the engine inlet cowling to prevent any icing from building in the first place. And then you got a slightly misleading term, which is wing anti-ice, because wing anti-ice is effectively used as a de-icer. You use it after ice has already built up in order to remove that ice again. Now, how can you tell that ice is building up? Well, let's say that we are not on the ground and we can't simply look outside of our aircraft. Then there are two dead giveaways for ice building up on the plane. The first one, if you're flying an Airbus, is the ice indicator probe on the strut beneath the front windows. If that one builds up ice, you can be sure that there is ice building up on the wings as well. And that is why you got the ice indicator probe light, which can light this thing up in the darkness. The second one, and that basically works for all aircraft, are the wipers. If ice is building up on the wipers, then you will also have ice on the wings, the stabilizers, and the rest of the airplane. Now, more on that later. One last general item to consider in winter operations is operational limitations. For example, the maximum crosswind limits of your aircraft may be significantly lowered when operating under winter conditions. For example, of the Airbus A320, you can have wind limits as low as 10 knots if you're operating on contaminated surfaces. So that is most definitely something to take into consideration. And with these general items in mind, let's now go into a couple of specifics that are most important for your anti-icing and winter operations. It's the beginning of our shift. We're arriving at the aircraft and we find ourselves in the winter season. The first question we should ask ourselves is, do we have either freezing or icing conditions? If we've got icing conditions, think about everything you might have to do before takeoff, like de-icing the aircraft, using anti-ice in your performance calculations, and so on. If we've got freezing conditions though, additional steps will be necessary. Now, in all Airbus aircraft and many Boeing or other manufacturers' aircraft, the first step when you get on board, after the airplane has been powered up in freezing conditions, will be to activate the probe and window heat. Now, this is done so that any contamination that may form on any of the probes outside the aircraft, such as your pitot tube, remember that's the thing that measures your airspeed, is melted and or does not form in first place. This is important so that your instruments are going to function during the follow-on takeoff. Now, once that is done, there may also be other specifics depending on your operations manual, so be sure to check the manual of your aircraft in question. Once that is done, we eventually arrive at a point where we have to decide if we want to or need to de-ice the aircraft. There is one general principle over here that we can use to start with. If there is any doubt, de-ice the airplane. However, let's talk about some generals of when we need to de-ice the airplane. So, irrespective of the weather condition, remember, the weather conditions do not influence the length of the walk-around. Irrespective of the weather condition, we are always going to check for any possible deposits we may find on the aircraft. For example, it may be a superb clear sky day in winter. You arrive at the aircraft, and even though there is absolutely nothing that would possibly hint at icing, you may still find icing, for example, on the wings. Because the airplane may have flown previously in very cold temperatures up at cruise level. The fuel becomes cold, and once the aircraft descends into the lower atmosphere, where there is more moisture in the air, that cold fuel still means the wings are going to be freezing cold, and ice may form on the wings. Now, there are certain limits of a maximum amount of the so-called cold-soaked fuel frost that you may have on the wings. For example, within the black area on the wing, you can have up to 3 millimeters on a Boeing 737 aircraft. Again, other manufacturers, other airlines may define that differently, so always refer to those specifics for your aircraft type. But icing may be found, and whenever icing is found, or whenever we are in conditions where new icing may actually build up, we need to de-ice the airplane. Now, the de-icing procedure itself can be split into two steps. Step number one is the actual de-icing part. Remember, de-icing means removing contaminants. The second step, if necessary, will be the anti-icing part, where new contaminants are prevented from building up on your airplane. So, to make things very simple, let's put it that way. If you're in conditions where the aircraft has ice on it, but there is no new ice expected to form, then you always do a one-step procedure. If new contaminants may form, for example because of prevailing snowfall, then you need to do a two-step procedure. So, before talking about the exact steps, let's quickly talk about the different types of anti-icing fluids that may be available. For those of you using GSX will ask you which fluid type you want to use, so listen carefully. So, there are 4 types of fluids. Type number 1 has a red or orange color, and it is the thinnest of the fluids. It flows off even at very low speeds and is therefore used as a de-icer only. That's the fluid that you will mostly be using if you are only doing a one-step procedure. Now, the type 2 fluid has a clear or straw color, and it requires a rotation speed of a minimum of 100 knots, so remember that when you are flying slower aircraft. And the advantages of type 2 fluid is that it provides a longer holdover time than the type 1 fluid, and it can be used as both a de- and anti-icer. Now, the type 3 fluid is basically one that's been created for turboprops or commuter aircraft. It requires a minimum rotation speed of 60 knots and it has a yellow color. For airliner operation on jet aircraft, Type 3 is basically not used. And finally there is the Type 4 fluid, which is the strongest of them all. It has an emerald green color, requires again a minimum rotation speed of 100 knots, and it offers the longest holdover time. It can be used as both a de- and anti-icer. Now, fluids tend to get more expensive the higher their number, so Type 1 fluid is the cheapest. That's why we do like to use it as a de-icer only. And then it gets better the higher the number. But remember, only Type 1, 2 and 4 fluids are used with jet aircraft operations. Now, let's go ahead and have a look into how to determine how long our holdover time, that is the time between de-icing the aircraft and commencing the takeoff, is going to be. The US FAA publishes tables that can be used to determine this, and here is an example of that table. If you simply Google for it, you will immediately always find the latest iteration of that table. Now, let's have a look into the holdover time guidelines. And we are going to do this on an example of a Type 1 fluid. So this is a generic table. And then there are also brand-specific tables. For example, if we look into the Type 2 fluids down here, you can see the generic holdover time table for Type 2 fluids. And then, if you know the exact brand of your de-icing fluid, like for example here, Clarion SafeWing MP2, and no, they do not pay me for mentioning them on this video, then you will always see that the brand-specific tables offer greater holdover times than the generic table. If you do not know which fluid is being used, use the generic table. If you know exactly which brand is being used, then use the brand-specific table from the holdover time. Now let's have a look into how to use such a table, and for that we are going to go down to the Type 4 fluids. So this is what the generic holdover time table for a Type 4 fluid looks like. And in general, you can do this quite easily. So you go in with the outside air temperature. So for example, temperature in our simulator right now is -5 degrees. So let's go ahead and go into the table with -5 degrees. So that's going to be this one, below -3 and -8. Then you got a mixing ratio, which is the ratio of actual de-icing fluid mixed with hot water. And as you can see at these temperatures, you can use either a ratio of 100% fluid or 75% fluid to 25% water. The reason you may want to mix these is because the water is obviously going to be cheap, the fluid is obviously going to be expensive, so that simply saves money. Now, looking into the generic holdover time table then, we next have to figure out the exact weather conditions that we currently have. And you will notice that there are loads of different definitions over here. What's going to be most relevant for your flight simulator operation is either freezing fog, or in general fog, and the different intensities of snowfall. Now, snowfall can be a little confusing because snowfall is given in the METAR or ATIS, but we cannot use that. So let's say that it says light snow in your METAR, you cannot use that. Much rather, you have to use a table to work out yourself how strong the snowfall actually is. Now let's go ahead and have a look at that table, and at this point thank you very much to Ops Group for making these lovely documents available. This is what the table looks like. Generally you use it as following. So the visibility is the general visibility from the METAR or ATIS. Do not use RVR figures, use the general visibility. Then we have to decide, is it day or is it night? And then we just go in with a visibility. Let's say for example that it is day right now. The temperature in our example is below -1 degrees and the visibility is 1,600 meters. In that case you can go into the table and you can see that with a visibility of 1,600 meters and a temperature at or below -1, we got light snow. Now, with this light snow, we're going to go into the holdover time table, so that's going to be over here, that one. And now we go right down to our mixing ratio and our temperature. And we can see that in this example, with our temperature at -5, mixing ratio of 100%, and light snow, we get a holdover time between 45 minutes to 1 hour and 35 minutes. So, from the moment that your de-icing commences to the takeoff, you may not wait longer than 45 minutes to 1 hour 35. Now that is quite the time span, and that's the reason because there are still variables in place, and ultimately it is up to the commander, that's you, to decide if your aircraft is still protected at the time you start your takeoff. So, once the de-icing procedure is commenced, and as always, have a look at the specific procedures for your aircraft. For example, in the A320, you're going to turn off the bleeds, you're going to turn off the packs, and then you are going to activate the ditching push button to close any valves on the outside. Once that is done, commence the de-icing procedure, write down the time at which it starts, and then apply your holdover time as necessary. When the procedure is complete, there will be a minimum time specified before you can activate your bleeds again. For example, that's 1 minute on the A320 over here to reactivate the APU bleeds. In that case, we go packs on, APU bleed on. Obviously, the ditching push button goes off, and then we can use APU bleed again. For the engine bleeds, there may be specific separate limits given in your aircraft's flight manual, so be sure to have a look at them. Now, once that is done, we have to look into our aircraft's manuals. Some manufacturers may want you to delay the extension of the flaps or the commencement of the flight control track until you're at the runway, so that you can avoid any snow falling into any of the drives for your flaps, for example. Now, once you're at the runway, you conduct the pre-takeoff check, where you decide, have the conditions changed? So, for example, has light snow become moderate snow or heavy? Have we seen any freezing rain in the meantime, which might have washed off some of the de-icing fluid? That's the type of stuff you think about. And most important, do not use any wing anti-ice if you are about to de-ice the aircraft, or if you have de-iced the aircraft. Wing anti-ice heats up the surface of the wing. That changes the viscosity, so the flowing characteristics of the de-icing fluid, and that invalidates the holdover time. So do not use wing anti-ice. Finally, consider if there may be any limits from your operator. For example, Boeing does not allow the use of assumed temperature, flex temperature in Airbus language, if the airplane has been de-iced. Do note that that's the Boeing limit. Airbus does not have such a limit. However, some operators may. Well, and that is how to de-ice your airplane. Let's next talk about the ground operations. So we have started our engines, we are now taxiing out for our takeoff. Now, it would be too easy if everything would be normal. In winter, it is not. So if we're operating in freezing conditions, then ice may form on the fan blades of our engines. And always remember, those are not de-iced. You cannot spray fluid in there because it would contaminate the air conditioning system, and engine anti-ice only prevents ice from building up on the engine intake, so on the cowling over here, and not on the fan blades themselves. Therefore, if we're operating in freezing conditions, it may be necessary to conduct engine run-ups. Now, since every airplane is different, and I just want to give you an idea of what's done over here, we are going to do this on the example of the Airbus A320. And every 30 minutes, you must run the engines up to 70% N1 for 30 seconds. If you're operating in freezing rain, freezing drizzle, freezing fog or heavy snow, you need to do this every 10 minutes. Alternatively, if you see the engine vibrations increase on the gauges, then you may also need to conduct an engine run-up. So that's any of them down here. During normal operations, if those increase, which would indicate that ice is building up on the fan blades, creating an imbalance and therefore creating the chance of the engine vibrating due to that imbalance, then the engine run-up needs to be conducted. So 70% N1 for 30 seconds. Be sure that the area behind the airplane is clear, coordinate with air traffic control if required, and then conduct the run-up. In any case, if you're about to take off, again, A320 specific, other airlines may have different figures, you need to conduct an engine run-up by spooling the engine up to 70% for 30 seconds. So you would go initially stabilize at 50%, then up to 70% for 30 seconds. Therefore, it is also required to do a standing takeoff, no rolling takeoff allowed here. And do tell ATC beforehand that you will need a longer time on the runway, because they do not expect those 30 seconds from you. And once the engine run-up is complete, you can go from 70% right to takeoff thrust. Next, let us talk about the biggest threat to an airplane in the air in winter conditions, and that is the fact that your altimeter is lying to you. Now, altimeters are calibrated for the ICAO standard atmosphere, and the ICAO standard atmosphere assumes 15 degrees Celsius at sea level. Now, when the air is warmer than that, it expands, which is one of the big topics we're talking about for summer operations. Remember the hot and high topic. But in winter, the opposite is the case. The air compresses as it is cooled down, and this means that you're going to be lower than your altimeter indicates. Therefore, we have to take a couple of provisions, especially for taking off and landing, but also for en route flight. So, for this reason, there is a table published by the ICAO that tells you how large those altimeter errors are going to be. We'll be talking about that table in a few moments, but let's first of all talk about when we need to correct the altimeter at all. Now, a correction should be considered when the outside temperature is below the ICAO standard atmosphere, but a correction must be done when the temperature is below ISA minus 15. So at sea level, that is conveniently 0 degrees. But let's just go a little bit higher. Let's take an airport at 5,000 feet elevation. In the ICAO standard atmosphere, the temperature decreases by 2 degrees every 1,000 feet of altitude. So if you've got an airport at 5,000 feet elevation, that means that the standard temperature over there is only going to be 5 degrees. Therefore, cold temperature correction needs to be applied if the temperature is 15 degrees colder than those 5 degrees, which means at minus 10 degrees or less. And that way you can determine when a correction is absolutely necessary. Now, next up we need to ask ourselves, which altitudes do we need to correct? And the answer to this is we need to correct any altitude that is located below the corrected minimum safe altitude. So let's have a look at an example. We are departing Cologne today, so let's enter that into our charts, and let's just get a departure chart over here. So we're departing runway 13 left, we got some on-off sits over here, so let's take that sit chart. And we are departing via the Cola for Foxtrot departure today, which is located right on here. Now, as you can see, there are a couple of restrictions on here, and there is an MSA of 3,800 feet. Now, the temperature is currently minus 5 degrees. So, since Cologne is located basically at the sea level, that means the temperature is colder than ICAO standard minus 15. so we need to apply the correction. Now, let's go ahead and first determine the temperature corrected minimum safe altitude. For this, let's go ahead and have a look into the correction table. Again, if you just Google for it or look into the video description below, you will find the link to the FAA website actually providing you that table. And now let's go ahead and have a look. So the MSA is 3,800. The field elevation is roughly 300 feet. So that means effectively we need to correct for 3,500 feet of altitude. So let's go ahead and enter the table. I would always take the more conservative figure. So let's start at a temperature of minus 10 degrees. Next we move to the right to the 3,000 feet prompt, which is 290 feet, and then we can add the 50 feet from the 500 feet prompt. So overall we need to add 340 feet to our MSA. That means that instead of an MSA of 3,800 feet, we are going to be using an MSA of 4,200 feet, rounded up. Always make it easy, round it up. So 4,200 is our new corrected MSA. So now we need to correct our temperature, or rather our altitudes, for anything below 4,200. And as you can see, there are quite a couple of restrictions in here that we need to take into consideration. So let's go ahead and start this. Moving over to our FMS, we can see we got an altitude restriction of plus 1,500 feet at Delta Kilo 130. We need to correct this. So instead of 1,500, we only consider the air that can shrink. So subtract the field elevation, which is 300 feet. That leaves us with 1,200 feet that we need to correct. Now 1,200 feet, we can take the 1,000 foot table at minus 10 degrees, which is 100. Then we can take the 200, which is 20. So we need to add 120 feet. So instead of 1,500, we are going to enter 1,620 as our new constraint for Delta Kilo 130. Now that much about our departure. Let's now talk about the arrival, because the arrival is especially tedious. Now, there is a difference between Airbus and Boeing here. Boeing allows you to edit anything in your FMS. Airbus does not. And this is important, guys. So let's say we were to fly an ILS approach to runway 23 left in Düsseldorf, which is what we currently have in our FMS. We start with our MSA. So 2,900 is the MSA in the approach area. We need to correct that. That's going to lead to roughly 3,200 feet. So anything below 3,200 needs to be corrected, right? Yes and no. Yes, if we are not operating under radar guidance, and if we are not flying an approach out of the FMS. So let's say, for example, the radar is inoperative. Then ATC may clear us to an altitude of 3,000, but we ourselves are responsible for ensuring that that's a safe altitude. Now, let's take this a little bit further and have a look into the approach itself. So we're coming in on the DOMOX 2-3 transition. We can see that there is an altitude restriction of flight level 140 or below at DOMOX. That is located above the temperature corrected MSA. Therefore, no temperature correction is necessary. We're flying that entire arrival. Over here we got 4,000 as our minimum en route altitude. That is above the corrected MSA, so no correction is necessary. And now we're getting to the final, from Delta Lima 450 onwards, where we got the restrictions at 3,000 feet or above. Those need to be corrected. However, Airbus does explicitly not allow to correct anything from the final approach fix onward to the missed approach point. What does that mean? That means we need to correct Delta Lima 450, 452, 454, 455 and enter the corrected altitudes in our FMS, but we must not correct our final approach fix, which is METMA for runway 23 left, Let's go back to the 2-3 left chart here. So this must not be corrected. Neither can we correct anything down here to the missed approach point. Now, the final approach fix and the missed approach point are very easy to identify. The final approach fix either has a P in the precision approach or an F in a non-precision approach. That's because, technically speaking, on a precision approach it's called the final approach point. Now, that means we must not correct the altitude at METMA. However, if we are following an ILS, then you are following ground-based guidance. That means radio waves are not bent by compressing air. So when you are flying the ILS in such conditions at -5 degrees, your altimeter is going to read something about 3,200 or 3,300 feet when you're crossing METMA. That is not an altimeter malfunction, that is normal in cold temperature. However, we must not correct this in our FMS, so anything from METMA onwards must be left unchanged. That's because of the way how the Airbus calculates its vertical profile on final approach. Now, this becomes even more important if we were to fly not an ILS, but a non-precision approach where vertical guidance from the FMS is required. So let's have a look at this one, which is the RMP approach to runway 23 left. We can see we got METMA in 3000. The MSA is again the same, so we know that METMA is below the corrected MSA. For this reason, in theory, it needs to be corrected. In practice, however, Airbus does not allow us to correct this. That's because the entire vertical profile would be messed up on the final approach, and therefore the final approach mode would become unreliable, and therefore you're not allowed to use it. Now, every non-precision approach has a published minimum temperature available. We can see that down here. Uncompensated baro VNAV not available below -15 degrees. So what does this mean? This basically means if the temperature is -15 degrees Celsius or higher, then you are allowed to fly this without applying a temperature correction in VNAV mode of your airplane. For Airbus, that means final approach mode. If the temperature drops below those -15 degrees, then you are no longer allowed to use the final approach mode, and then you must fly the approach with the track or nav as lateral mode and FPA as vertical mode. When that happens, you need to apply corrections to all of those altitudes. That includes your final approach fix as well as the entire descent table. Now, in the real world, our chart app is capable of doing that automatically. You just enter the altitudes, it tells you immediately what the corrected altitudes are. For flight simulation, there are loads of different apps available on the internet, and there is even an EASA spreadsheet that you can use to figure out the corrected altitudes so that you don't have to use the table. Also be aware that the flight path angle, so the 3 degrees over here, may have to be increased because of the altimeter corrections. So it may become something like 3.2 or 3.3 degrees in order to be able to follow the glide slope. Determine all of that during your approach preparation and then use it if needed. So generally, always have a look at the minimum temperature for non-precision approaches, and while -15 may sound very cold and unlikely during this kind of operation, let's just have a look at one other example to tell you how likely it actually is that you may encounter something like this. So this is the RMP approach chart for the RMP Zulu runway 26 in Innsbruck. Now, Innsbruck, one of those airports that are really known for cold temperatures. Now look at this. Uncompensated baro VNAV systems procedure not available below airport temperature -7. And you can see that suddenly -7 in Innsbruck is a very common scenario. So always have a close look into those temperature limits, and if your temperature becomes too low, you must fly the approach using FPA mode rather than using your lovely automation and being able to use final approach mode. So always be aware of that. There is one final step that we need to talk about when talking about cold temperature corrections, and that is your minimum safe altitude and route. So let's just go over to the en route chart over here and have a look. So just gonna go down somewhere nice. So let's go down to the Alps and have a look over here. So first of all, I want the low airways chart, and daylight is good, thank you. Alright, so now we are flying along the airways, and we're flying across the Alps. You can see MSA 17,400 feet, 16,200 feet. However, those MSAs, once again, need to be temperature corrected. Therefore, we need to determine what is our minimum usable flight level, MUFL. Sounds interesting when you pronounce it that way. Now, there is some general easy guidance on how to calculate the minimum usable flight level. First of all, you need to correct for the QNH. So let's say the QNH is, for example, 9R77. Then you need to use 1 hectopascal below the standard. So 1 hectopascal below 1013 equals 30 feet and equals an increase of your MSA by 30 feet. And then for a temperature of each 10 degrees below ICAO standard, you need to add 4%. So let's do a very easy calculation. Let's say that our minimum en route altitude is 12,000 feet. Now the temperature is minus 30 degrees at our cruise level of level 160, and the lowest local QNH is known to be 9R77 hectopascals. So what do we need to do then? First of all, let's figure out the difference from the ICAO standard. So the ICAO standard temperature at flight level 160, our cruise level, would be minus 17 degrees. However, the actual outside temperature is minus 30. That means we got a deviation of minus 13 degrees Celsius, which corresponds to approximately 5%. So with our minimum safe altitude of 12,000 feet, we now need to add 5%, leading to about 12,600 feet. Next, we need to apply the correction due to the altimeter difference. So we need to do the following. You take 1013 hectopascals and subtract those 977 hectopascals, which gives you 36 hectopascals of difference. Now, if you take those already corrected 12,600 and add 36 times 30 feet, you end up at 13,680 feet. In other words, even though we've got a published minimum safe altitude of 12,000 feet, our minimum usable flight level is flight level 140 because of the effects of the atmosphere on your altimeter. Now, last but not least, you may be wondering, so what if I'm flying under ATC guidance? Do I need to ignore the altitudes they give me and apply corrections? The answer is, if you're under radar guidance, which means the controller has set something like radar contact or identified, then ATC is responsible to applying altitude corrections, and therefore you can simply fly whatever ATC clears you to. Even if you're on an approach like this one to Düsseldorf over here, ATC can clear you down to 3,000, even though that is below the corrected MSA. If ATC is doing that, then they have done the math and they are allowed to do it. Then it's safe to fly that altitude. However, if you are flying without radar guidance, then you must ensure any clearance is safe according to the corrected values and always respect the minimum usable flight level. May become very important when you're flying in Greenland or in northern Canada. There isn't radar coverage everywhere. Last but not least, even in such cases, always correct the minimum. So very easy going. Let's take the ILS approach to runway 23 left in Düsseldorf. The minimum is 340 feet, which conveniently is already given as 200 feet above the ground. So we got those 200 feet above the ground over here, and we can go back into the table. 200 feet above the ground, temperature minus 10, we can easily see that's 20 feet we need to add. So instead of 340 feet, our new minimum becomes 360 feet. Easy, isn't it? Now we're flying and we're getting into the region of our approach or a holding. As you can imagine, when ice builds up on the airplane, your drag increases. For this reason, minimum speeds might have to be increased in flight when ice accretion is expected. For this, it's a good idea just to have a look at the surfaces of the airplane that are getting de-iced. As you can see, not all of them are, so parts of the wings may not be de-iced, the vertical stabilizer may not be de-iced. So we're sitting in an A320 here, which leads us into quite a comfortable position, because you can see we got surfaces over here that are de-iced on the stabilizers. Try a 737. The entire tailplane does not have a de-icing system, only the wings do. For this reason, the minimum speed in flight may have to be increased when ice accretes on the airplane. So, for example, let's have a look into the Airbus A320 over here. When wing anti-ice is operative, the minimum speed increases in either clean flap configuration or config 1, 2 or 3 by 10 knots, so minimum speed is VLS plus 10. In config full, the minimum speed still is VLS plus 5. Now take a Boeing 737 and things get a lot more interesting. On the 737, because the tailplane is not de-iced, you're actually going to increase your minimum speed by 20 knots for the entire rest of the flight, if wing anti-ice was used at any time in the flight. Imagine flying a 737 from a wintry Cologne, like we are over here, to a lovely 25 degrees down at the Canary Islands. If you've used wing anti-ice during your departure, your minimum speed on landing at 25 degrees in the Canaries is going to be increased by 25 knots. Now, the 737 applies those changes automatically to the speed indicator whenever wing anti-ice has been used in flight, but this is something that you absolutely need to be aware of, in case you think like, why is my airplane indicating such strange things to me? It's not supposed to do that. Well, chances are it actually is. Now, last but not least, we've completed our flight, we've landed at our destination, and we are taxiing off the runway. However, we've flown through icing conditions. What could possibly happen? Well, ice may have formed on the aircraft in flight. The only parts of the wing that are de-iced by your wing anti-ice system are the leading edges. However, ice may also form on the flaps, for example. Now, ice is very hard. For this reason, if you try to retract the flaps while there is ice on them, chances are you can break the flaps or the wing. For this reason, if you've suspected that ice may have built up on the flaps during the arrival, do not retract the flaps. Keep them extended, taxi into the gate, have your ground staff or your pilot monitoring on the next walk around, have a look at the flaps, and only then retract the flaps. This basically applies to any airplane that you can possibly think of. Well, my friends, and this is the quick Winter Ops refresher for the winter season 2025 to 2026. As always, if you're a real pilot, refer to your manuals and not to any flight sim videos. Shame on you for doing that in first place. And if you're a flight simmer and interested in more, then check out the little bit more detailed guides from last year and the year before on both the A320 as well as the Boeing 737 that I'm going to link in the video description below. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you found this one interesting, and with that I'm signing off. Hope that you are going to have safe travels during the winter time. Put any questions in the comments beneath the video, and then I'm looking forward to see you guys again on the next one.